First off, great problem to have all these people. It's going to get warm in here. I think it'll be worth it. On your seat, I have both a capital campaign and a membership card. So if you're not already a member or haven't looked into our capital campaign, this is your chance. We've raised $835,000, a combination of grants and public monies and membership and so forth. So we're really close. We're less than $100,000 from having enough to do phase one, which we talked about before. First phase is moving up to the upstairs, the office area, so we can use that as an exhibit space. And then we're going to have a temporary room for meetings like this, but then we'll be able to transform this into more exhibits. So anyway, talked about this a lot, but I really encourage everyone this is the time to put us over the top. And now I happen to run in. I've been thinking about this, about asking John, because I've been on cemetery tours of doing a program such as this, and I just happened to be out the county building one day, and we saw each other in the parking lot, and I said, would you ever consider doing something on architecture? And he said, yeah, I'll do that. And I said, you already have a program off the shelf? And he said, no, but I can throw something together. So he's had a couple of months, but if anybody's ever been on the cemetery tours, I think you're in for a real treat. And then the subject itself is fascinating to everybody, I'm sure. I just remember a few years, when I was away from Urbana for about 31 years. I've actually grew up here at the school, lived right behind here. But I remember when Urbana wasn't doing what it's doing today. It's actually, if you go downtown, you can feel the energy and people moving in here and so forth. But I remember a friend describing the town as, it's worn smooth. And I kind of know what that means if you think about it. Is, you have an old chair that's worn smooth, and I think that's true. And I've had people from out of town just recently, they come here and they really marvel at the houses here. And then you'll have people from out of town, they come down and say, what did you guys do? Everybody rich in this town? So anyway, I'm really excited to have John here. I appreciate you doing this. I'll turn it over to you, John.
Thank you. Yeah, like Ken, I've been away for a while too, about 15 years, and thanks to the pandemic, they've been able to split time between Urbana and Metro Detroit. So a lot of times I'm up in Michigan, and I just happen to be home this weekend and going to be home here for the pretty much the following week. But I like that warm, smooth. I think that could be our new branding. Urbana, warm, smooth. So I like that. I am not a native of the community, as a lot of you know. Came here with my folks with Navistar in 1989, at which time there was a battle in the Bright household, and this was my stance towards Urbana. I am not moving to that backward state or town. What do you mean they have school levies? We've never heard of that in Indiana. That's true. They do not have school levies. But lo and behold, fell in love with it. My mother said, wait until you see the town Dad and I want to live in. It reminds you of Marshall, Michigan. Yeah, right. Yeah, right. Marshall, Michigan is about an hour north of my hometown, Auburn, Indiana. And we would go there every year for their historic home tour. They have beautiful historic homes. And when mother told me that, I was like, yeah, okay, whatever. What? Yeah, it's no Marshall, whatever. And when I started to come down and visit, like, she's right. It is very much like Marshall. In fact, I would say it's even a little bit better than Marshall. And it's because of all those trips that I got dragged off to in Marshall, Michigan over the years, is why we have the historic home tour today in Urbana. My mother started it based on Marshall. And she had people who organized the tour in Marshall come down and speak in Urbana and tell the folks here how they organized their tour. So that's how we got the historic home tour started, because we fell in love. Well, when we first lived in town, when we first moved to town, and I did finish school in Indiana, that, I wasn't sure about the place, but come to find out, I am actually a distant descendant to a lot of old families from Champaign County and Urbana that eventually ended up in Indiana. And when we started to look for a house to restore of our own, we found one on East Reynolds, just off of Main Street. And my mother was not sure that she wanted to take on this house. And we looked at houses all over town and just didn't find the one that just got our interest. And my dad and my mother's walking up the steps. We went to the open house. We were the only ones to show up to the open house that day. And my mother's going up the steps telling my dad and I, now don't make any moves because I'm not sure about this place. And my dad and I walk in and here's the staircase and this big pocket door and all this woodwork and the stained glass everywhere that you couldn't see from outside because the storm windows were so dirty, so we didn't even know it was his house. And my dad and I go, oh wow, this is the one, right in front of the building. And go running up the stairs and we're opening and closing the pocket doors and my mother's just glaring at me. Hey, Bob. And after I went off to college in Missouri for historic preservation for undergraduate, which we had to take architecture classes for, that sometimes my mother and father would get into battles while I was gone. And they would call me, and sometimes I think something was wrong. Because my mom would call me, and she goes, and I'm 8 hours away, and she goes, John, what? She goes, your dad wants to do this in the house, and I told him it's not historically accurate. Would you set him straight? What? So anyway, got hooked on the architecture of the city, and much like Ken said, you know, they, oh, we got to do it right here. All right, doesn't like the technology. Oh, there it goes, it's delayed reaction. I grew up among the Amish, technology night. So like Ken said, this is the quote I always got. What was, and I need to stress this, what was ever in Urbana, that's usually the tone when someone made that statement, what was ever in Urbana that they built such houses? And usually when they said that, they were normally thinking of Scioto Street, right? It's a state highway, gets all the exposure, people go ooh and ah as they drive down Scioto Street, right? And historically, it was often referred to as Urbana's premier historic neighborhood, as Urbana's premier neighborhood. Even back in the 19th century, or it was the country estates of Urbana, because they started to build the larger homes on the edge of town at the time that had the large lots and the sweeping views, and those were the country estates, like we were the big suburbs, you know. So, but what was in Urbana that they built such houses? So to understand the story of Urbana's architecture, you kind of got to know the story of Urbana, and kind of the main moments in time that kind of changed our trajectory of being ho-hum, rural Ohio county seat to something a little bit different. Because a lot of times if you go to towns near us of equal size or a little bit larger, they do not have the architectural building stock that we typically have. Not that they don't have grand homes and great neighborhoods in some of their communities too, but it's just not on Scioto Street. It's throughout town in different places, and to be a historic home, or live in a historic home, it doesn't mean it's the houses that were associated with the wealthy or the famous or there's some big connection. There could be homes across the city that could be vernacular or folk Victorian or not the elaborate or big houses, but they still have significance because there might be a cultural connection to them. They might be part of the Irish story. They might be part of the African American story of Urbana. Those too have merit. So it's not always about the larger historic ornate homes in the community. It's really looking at the whole tapestry of the city. So what happened in Urbana that they got such houses that everyone wants to know about? All right, it does not like me. Okay, I got backwards there. Right? First thing, War of 1812. We were the governor's headquarters during the War of 1812 for the armies of the Northwest Territories. That guy, General Hall, that's my guy, he was the territorial governor of Michigan. It's really weird to be up in Michigan and in Detroit and see historic signs around the metro that describe Paul's Trace coming from Urbana. And you're standing 200 miles away from Urbana, reading about Urbana, knowing I'll be going home to Urbana that night. So that's pretty cool. So General Hall, kind of a scapegoat in the War of 1812, who things did not go well. And he came to Urbana, and they set up Urbana as this major military post because at the time, we were pretty much the largest frontier outpost between here and the D, Detroit. And the armies of the Northwest Territories gathered here. He had an encampment, about a few hundred men that were here, and they marched towards Detroit with the British. And he was defeated. He pretty much handed Detroit over to the British. We got it back, obviously, but he was defeated. But during that time, that was the first time since Urbana's founding in 1805 that we kind of got on the radar in a major way. That we were known from a political standpoint, we were known from a military strategy standpoint, and all those soldiers from the Northwest Territories, including Kentucky, that were exposed to this area, some of them stayed, some of them returned. So that was the first infusion, and if you will, the first sort of economic boom, 6 years after the city's founding, that started to kind of put us on the map. And of course, by being that military outpost that we were, an important one in the War of 1812, of course we attracted tradespeople, professional people, skilled people. So they started to influence the shape of the early beginnings of the town. So that was the first thing. Oh, come on here, don't mess with me. There we go. The new church, the Swedenborgian Society. Even though there were Swedenborg families in Urbana pre-1840, the 1840s through 1900, really, we felt the influence of these families. Colonel James, the Gwynns, the Sewells, the Murdochs, all families that we can see in our architectural landscape yet today, and our environment, like Cedar Bog, thanks to these families that we have yet today. Colonel James' political influence helped shape Urbana, helped shape the state with the construction of the first railroads, of which came through Urbana, one of the state's first railroads. The banking industry, where Urbana was considered a powerhouse in early banking through Colonel James's endeavors. The Urbana University, founded by the new church in 1850, which, by the way, half the population hated and didn't want anything to do with it, advocated for their children not to go there. But the university put that on the map. And all of these families also typically came from the East Coast, wealthy families. They were educated, they were traveled, they invested their money into local initiatives like banking, like railroad, like industry, like the university, their time, their talents, their efforts. They knew what was fashionable, what was trending, what was sophisticated, and so that infusion of the Swedenborg families and their knowledge, their wealth, their influence, their political power changed Urbana. There would never have been a university, even though it struggled for years, there never would have been a university in Urbana had it not been for them. There would not have been some of the grand houses that you think of, particularly around the university, had it not been for these families. The education, the cultural programming that they brought, music, literature, art, all infused into Urbana through the Civil War and beyond. Especially some of the heyday of the university when it saw some of its largest growth. It was through the New Church Society and the Swedenborg families. See if we can get it right. Hey, we got one. Factories and farms is sort of the third boom in time period. A lot of industry really started to ramp up in Urbana during this time period. But the interesting thing is, a lot of it was being capitalized, the stock was being capitalized by many local families. Or the industries themselves were being founded by local families. The Johnsons, the Marvins are two examples. They brought that influence, that connection, that investment to Urbana that continued to spur the growth. And at the same time, the railroads were continuing to come into Urbana that made it possible to make us attractive for some of these industries that were coming into the city as well to move goods and services and people. So that was part of it. And by that time period, the farmland around us in Urbana and Champaign County was considered to be some of the richest in the state. And it was not unusual that many families who lived in town also had farming operations out in the county, and sometimes very substantial ones. And so that connection between the farmland of Champaign County in and around Urbana and beyond, and the industrial influences that were coming into the city, many times with local families behind them, that also influenced us. And they influenced the architecture by the buildings that they built for their homes, or that they acquired for their homes, or that they built for their local industries. So those three things really changed our trajectory in terms of the physical environment. And then, or like Ken said, worn and smooth. We kind of went to sleep. Why? What happened after, I don't know, 1920, 1929 particularly? Crash! The Depression. The Depression came. Everyone started to slow down. People weren't building the big homes. People weren't building the smaller homes. The downtown kind of went to sleep. Urbana was still functioning, but there wasn't the building, the investment going on in Urbana or anywhere else for that matter, not until after World War II. And the boom and the economic booms with that, we started to see a pickup again in housing developments in the 40s and the 50s, starting on the north end a lot of times with Grimes Circle and Mr. Grimes' efforts on the north end of town to house the men coming back from World War II. There was a housing crunch. Gee, sound familiar? Seems like we go through this every 60, 70 years. There's a housing crunch. There's a housing crunch. We need more housing. We need more housing. We need affordable housing. Well, they went through that again in the late 40s, 50s, and 60s as well. And of course, the whole architectural narrative about Urbana and the country changed. They weren't building the elaborate Victorian-era houses or things of that nature. They started to go with more modern trends to meet that demand. But that's what kind of happened, that we have to understand what was ever in Urbana. It's not necessarily what was ever in Urbana, it's like whatever happened to Urbana through the time periods, that it changed everything, that you can go up the road to Bellefontaine even and look at their community and say, gosh, they just don't have what we necessarily have. And by design, you know, we all travel to communities, right? That people are like, oh gosh, I love the way that community looks. I love it, great. I work in community and economic development. Newsflash, it didn't fall out of the sky that way. They made decisions locally that protected and cherished and valued what they had. And I think that's another testament to Urbana, that Urbana really likes its historic homes. It really likes its historic cemetery. It really likes its history. And part of that, we've kind of been pretty good caretakers of it for the most part. And that's why we have that. Remember 20-some years ago, CVS wanted to tear down a bunch of houses on the edge of Cider Street and build a new CVS? No. You just don't touch Cider Street. Oh, we'll make a book. No, you just don't do it. You just don't touch Cider Street. So that was what was happening. So all the while, we as Urbana citizens of the past had access to travel, books, architects, newspapers, catalogs, pattern books, touting good design and latest styles and trends in architecture. Before the days of HGTV, Chip and Joanna, open floor plans, and the lady who lives where I work and live too, Nicole Curtis, lives in Oakland County where I live and work, or Bargain Block in Detroit. And if I hear one more time, we need an open floor plan. No, you don't always need an open floor plan. Or we're going to paint our house black and white. So, but we had these trends available to us because the local newspapers would carry house plans. It was good business back in the day, and still should be today, that you touted the quality of place of this city. And they often touted this city as a place with beautiful homes, gorgeous homes, well-maintained, tastefully built. That was part of our promotion. Not worn and smooth. We weren't worn and smooth at that time. But they were touting Urbana because of how it looked. They knew that that attracted residents, visitors, and investment. Guess what? 150 years later, it's still the same. People choose, in part, by where they're going to live, by how the community looks and feels. That's how I got here. Wait until you see Urbana, it's like Marshall, Michigan. Yeah, whatever. They could have lived anywhere. They could have lived in Springfield. They could have lived in St. Paris. They could have lived in Sydney. They could have lived in Bell Fountain. They chose Urbana because there was something about the character of the city that spoke to them. And I've met many people over the years like, I love Urbana because of your houses. They love the city because of the architecture. So all that influence and travel, the Sewell family traveled throughout Europe. A lot of the Swedenborg families were exposed to Europe. Art, magazines that were popular during the time, pattern books that were popular at the time, that builders and residents would use alike. They gave them ideas. And a lot of our more prominent families, they had connections or they could reach out to prominent architects like that guy up there. That's Frank Packard and Yost and Packard, who the firm designed some of our very significant, well-known structures in the city based out of Columbus. And a lot of times, like Colonel James went to West, who was the architect of the State House in Columbus, and got him to design Bailey Hall, the original building for Urbana University. So our Bailey Hall at Urbana University is the same architect as the Ohio State House. And he was a state legislature member, so he kind of had that exposure and connection. Say, hey, I'd like you to look at a project in Urbana. So we had all this connection and influences that was all this intake of information through all these periodicals and relationships and newspapers and magazines and books that not only the residents were using, but the contractors and builders were using too. Because as they were building houses, and just like today, there were homes built in Urbana on speculation by contractors. And they were looking at these type of periodicals or information to see, what do I want to build? I think this plan, this look will work out fine. And they would buy a lot, and they would put up a house, and it would be sold. Just like today. Here we go with the styles. This is architectural light. And I know there's an architect in the room, so forgive me if I don't get it all right. But this is going to be architectural light, but I hope when you leave here today, you're driving down streets in town, say, that's a da-da-da-da house. Nothing drives me crazy. Any realtors in the room? Don't want to raise your hand? It drives me to distraction. There's my Southern Missouri coming out. When I see real estate ads and they call a house a Cape Cod, and it is not a Cape Cod. It is not even close. Or it's Victorian. Victorian is an era. It is not a style. It is an era. And they call it, well, that's a bungalow. Yes, a bungalow is a type, but it's not the style per se. So, realtors, watch your styles. People like me, it drives me crazy when you don't get it right. So, I want to write it. It's like, that is not here. Let me correct your writing for you. That's not what you're describing. So, Adam, federal style, early time periods here. So, roughly, even though we weren't around in 1780, but roughly this style in America, 1780, 1840, a little bit creeps over in our time period too, because we weren't founded until 1805. But basically, these type of houses, people say, oh, that's just a plain house. There's more than meets the eye, sometimes with just what we may think is a simple or plain house. There's symmetrical facades. If you look at the house there, you can see that I'm not going to even use the pointer because I think it will throw me off with the projector, and I'll be on slides that I don't want to be on. But you can see the windows are in a row there, and the door lines up. The porch on this house came later. That porch is not original. That porch is more early 20th century, late 19th century. And this house was moved here. I probably got about 20 houses in my file that I track that they no longer set where they originally were, that they were moved. They moved houses in town all the time. Because we just didn't throw it in the landfill, we recycled them. We reused them. And a lot of times they were moved out of the way because the downtown was growing, and so they needed more space for the commercial area. or someone had bought the lot and that house was considered out of vogue architecturally from a design standpoint, but it was still a solid house, and someone say, I'll buy that house for little money and move it to my lot, and I'll use it as a rental property, I'll reuse it for my own purposes. Happened all the time. They're hard to track of where they are, but I've at least got 20 houses I can point to in Urbana that have been moved from their various locations. This was one of them. This guy originally sat on Scioto Street in downtown, and about 1913, he landed over here on East Market Street. And it's got the thick hewn mortise and tenon timbers that we think of when we think of barn construction. So it's a really, really early house. It's a hall and parlor design, which basically means when you come through the front door, there's a nice wide hallway and the staircase is open and turns and goes upstairs, and to the right is the parlor. So it's basically kind of a two-room plan. So side or hip gables, this is a side gable, meaning the roof is running this way. Limited detailing except for around the front door, and this is a very simple house because it's early. You can see the side lights and the transoms there, the little windows around the front door. Sometimes they have an entry porch, sometimes they do. Like I said, this porch came much later on this house. They often have 6/6 windows, and what's that mean? 6 panes of glass over 6 panes of glass. So if you can see there in the photograph, the windows upstairs are still the original windows with the 6 panes of glass, the 6 panes of glass. Sometimes have arched entrances with the fan lights, the arched openings over the top, and the side lights. This doesn't have the fan light, but it does have the side lights. And sometimes they have decorative cornice detailing. So that's the cornice area, is that area right there above the second floor windows near the roof line. This one may have had the detailing, but it's kind of hard to tell because this house has been sided. So if it had some kind of detailing up there, it was probably removed or covered up when they applied the siding to it. Oops, wrong way. I'm getting the hang of it. So here's just some other examples of sort of federal era, and you start to see some other influences of time in architecture creep in. What's known as the Musgrove House on Miami Street, here the big picture on the left. The Sweet House on South Main Street dates from 1828. Again, very early house, it's used for apartments. Proud to say I've acquired the Hubby Murphy house there in the middle. Some people say it looks like the Alamo. And when you actually put a picture of the Alamo, it does. It actually lines up with the Alamo. And it was actually, part of the house is 200 years old. This is a funky house to figure out. And we've acquired this house since I've come back to Urbana. And slowly working on it. Always loved this house. Funny story, how many know the Murphy family? They've lived here for years? Yep. So the Murphys had this house basically from the late 1960s until recently. And I've always loved this house. And I knew the history of it was mostly with the Hovey family, H-O-V-E-Y, the Hovey family. Multiple generations of the Hoveys lived here from roughly 1845, which was the Mexican War, Alamo time, to 1944 was the last of the family who occupied this house. And always loved this house, and is coming back and forth from Michigan, always, looking at this house, knew it was empty, and I was really worried about it. And was talking to Gene Fields one day, said, Gene, I don't know the Murphys, but I just want to help them. I just want to help them because she's falling apart, and no one was living in it. And Gene goes, hey, I saw Bobby and Sharon, and they're going to call you. Mr. Murphy called me, downloaded all the history. I'm just like, he didn't know any of that. And he just telling all the history of the house. And he goes, well, John, would you like to come see it? Yeah, I'd like to. Yeah, that'd be great. That'd be great. Hung up the phone, yelled upstairs to Jim, Jim, we get to go see the Hovey house. We get to go see the Hovey house. Mr. Murphy calls back. 10 minutes later goes, hey John, would you be interested in buying it? It's like the dog that chases the bus. Got the bus. And first order of business was to find a historic mason who knows what they're doing to work on this house. And we found one, fortunately. And the first order of business was the parapet there. It kind of looks like the Alamo. It was leaning forward. It was about ready to fall forward. So they took that kind of all apart and put it back together. Where the windows had sagged, they pushed everything back up to side. But here's how people can get tricked if they don't know what to do and not to do in a historic home. First mason I had look at this house, walks out, and I can usually tell in 3 seconds if they know what they're talking about. He did not. He goes, well, I'll give you a quote for gutting it. Gutting what? He goes, well, the house, you got to get the weight off of it. Every interior wall in that house is brick. Did you not see the steel beams that were running the length of it in the house that someone put in the basement? No, we're not gutting it. Thank you for playing. We have some lovely parting gifts and rice-a-roni and encyclopedia. You are not touching the hubby house. So we were fortunate enough to find someone who actually knew what they were doing with historic masonry and mortar, and slowly working on this house. First order of business was the masonry work and replacing 42 broken panes of glass. So all the glass was repaired and put back in the windows. And this is how history can get twisted over time. People said, oh yes, it had a ballroom on the second floor. Yes, there is a large room on the second floor where the balcony is that has these built-in dressers on each side of the room. And the Murphys in the 60s put a petition down the middle of the room that divided it into two, but you can clearly see that it was one large room. And in the 1950s, the Urbana Citizen wrote an article about the house that Abe Hare had bought at this time and was living here, and gave the story like, oh, one can only imagine the large room on the second floor was the ballroom for the Huffy family, and they can imagine toasting their family and friends. The Hubbies were prohibitionists. There was no drinking in that house. There was no toasting. And what it was, the Hovey family had 5 daughters and 3 sons. That large room on the second floor with the built-in dressers, that was the girls' dormitory. That was not a ballroom, but I can see where people thought about that. The house down below, the Fifey home, had the portico added to it sometime after 1910. Picture that house without that. So that's a later architectural embellishment onto this house that, you know, people change porches and things to kind of bring them into modern style. But that house actually dates from the 1830s and 40s, and just picture it without the portico or the columns porch there, and that's actually what that house would have looked like.
Where's that house at, sir?
West Market.
Thank you.
West Market and Walnut. So we got South Main, East Water Street, West Market, and Miami Street. Recognize them all? Good. I'm running all over town. I'm sure people have me on their Ring cameras, you know, taking pictures of their houses or whatever. Like, there's some guy running around town taking pictures. Greek Revival. These are the next big movements in architecture. And most of American architectural styles in Urbana are often influenced by European styles, with few exceptions. So a lot of our architecture get their traits from something in Europe that we inspired. So, you know, after we became a nation, you know, the U.S. is looking towards Greek and Roman architecture because home of democracy, so we kind of incorporated that into our architecture. And this is a really high style example. This is 1842, the Miller Mossgrove house, totally intact for the most part. And it's on Miami Street, sets up on the knoll, on the south side of the street in the 300 block. But pristine Greek Revival example that's out of Menard Lefevre. That was one of the pattern books at the time, and he was an advocate for the Greek Revival style. So he wrote about the Greek Revival style. And in these books, they would often have plates and drawings about proper, appropriate Greek Revival style. So they literally used his book, his pattern book, to do that. How do I know that? Because I've got the handwritten notes from the Miller family describing when this house was being built and instructions to the contractor to use Menard Lefevre's architectural plan book, pages da-da-da-da for that. So beautiful house with the columns. This house on East Water Street is also Greek Revival, just a different form of it. This one was built in 1857. This was built as the parsonage for the old Grace Methodist Church, or the Second Methodist Church that stood on East Water Street, and they built this as their parsonage next door to the building. The ladies had teas, raising money for it. It took them a couple years to build this building, but it too is Greek Revival. So Greek Revival, basically 1825 to 1860, again, symmetrical facades, and you look at that, the windows and the doors pretty much all line up. Side gable, cross gabled, hip gabled, I didn't put the cross gable in there, or all types of variations. The Miller Mosgrove house that we just saw on Minor Street, that's kind of a low pitched, gabled roof on there. Limited detailing, except for around the front door with transoms and side lights. This particular house, they didn't do it. There's a little bit of a transom above the door. And then the entry porch is either full width with squared or rounded columns. Well, the Mosgrove Miller house had the rounded columns with the Ionic capitals. 6/6 windows. The Miller Mosgrove house still had their windows. These windows have been changed. So these are not the original windows. These are replacement windows. The cornice lines are usually emphasized with wide and divided bands of trim. You can see that wide trim around the cornice, and sometimes supported with brackets. So you can see the brackets, but the brackets are normally just decorative. So here's some Greek Revivals. Up on the left, we got the house, what I call the Houston House. Frank Houston on South Main Street. Again, see that Greek Revival detailing around the door. It's the flat, they call pilasters, the flat half columns coming down the side of the door, that wide trim piece over the top. And then you can see the wide band again, and this is a low-hipped house, roof house with the brackets. What I call the brand house, a lot of times I refer to houses in town by historical names, and people kind of look at me like, oh yeah, I need to call it this house because you don't know what I'm talking about. So the brand house there is kind of an upright and wing version of Greek Revival. The wing portion of the house is earlier than the upright part. The upright part, the two-story part, typically came later in these type of houses. And again, it's got the Greek Revival detailing around the door, around the cornice and the brackets, symmetrical facades, everything's kind of lining up. And again, a lot of people look at these houses saying, well, that's a pretty plain house. Yeah, there's actually a lot more going on there than what you think. The other house to the right is on West Court Street. The porch again has been changed. That's a much later porch on this house, but you can still see the Greek Revival detail with those cornice lines that come down like this, and they go, and they come in. That's kind of, that Greek Revival styling. The next one, the green color house, that's actually on College Street, and it's actually facing sideways, because historically, the other houses that it's facing were not there. That was all part of its property. And those lots got subdivided off and the houses built in front of it. So the front of that house is actually facing the neighbor's house. And it had this side porch on it, and until a few years ago, this house still had the original rounded Greek porch columns on it. And someone took them off and changed it. And the two windows there you see on the porch were actually French doors that open down onto the porch, but someone has changed them. They're just regular windows now. Down here, the house on South Main Street that sits back, one of the early Weaver houses. Again, the porch is a later addition onto this house, but again, it kind of has that Greek Revival feeling going on. Mary's house, right there on Water Street, on West Water Street. The Shirey house, you can see the Greek Revival coming down. The little house, the little brick house, is on East Reynolds, clear down by the Bundy factory. Again, the porch is much later on this house, but again, it's got the Greek Revival detailing. And then the Patrick House on the far right on Sido and Kenton Street, built in 1855. Those are the original porch columns, still has the 6/6 windows, the Greek Revival detailing, and the original windows. So there's just a little bit of a sampling of some of the Greek Revival around town. Whoops, going backwards. You think I'll get the hang of this? I'm going backwards. Going back in some time. There we go. Gothic. Love Gothic. So this is the granddaddy of Gothic Revival in town. This is right out of Andrew Jackson Downing's book about Gothic revival, Gothic architecture. And again, these styles were inspired from old European styles. So Gothic revival, this is textbook example, has not changed hardly since it was built, with the exception of a glass conservatory that was at one time located on the east end of the house that has since been gone for many, many years. But beautiful detailing, the original porch, the original balcony, the original windows, the original verge board, or the gingerbread, some people call it there on the gables, the rounded chimneys, literally right out of his book. I don't know if you remember the one slide that showed the sketch of what this house was. That was from Andrew Jackson Downey's book of this type. So the Gothic revival styles, roughly 1840, 1880. This is Barb Sauer's former home on Lafayette that you may be seeing on there, also Gothic. A little bit later porch on it. Steeply pitched roofs on the gables, or a side gable. Gable usually ornamented with decorative verge board, like I said, some people call it gingerbread. Windows extending into the gables, so you can see there the window is like jutting up into the gable. And they have those Gothic shaped pointed arch, sometimes called lancet windows. Entry porch again is full width of the house, or of the house for the most part. The drip molding details around windows and doors, and when I say that, drip molding, it does this. If this is the top of the window, it comes across the window, drops down, and then flares out. That's the Gothic detail. And you see that over doors too. Open rake gables with either enclosed or exposed rafters of purlin. So sometimes you may see these detailings under the gables that look like the rafters sticking out. Here's some Gothics. Little house up on West Church Street. It doesn't have all the verge board anymore, but you can kind of see there. It's got the Gothic door a little bit. Little house on Scioto and Happersett. I call it the Happersett house. Porch originally went across the front of the house. You can see the ghost line on the paint where it was at one time, but it's been gone for many years. So the porch would have gone across the front, and that window on the second floor would have been a door. You can see where it's been shortened, it would have gone out onto the balcony. The house on the right, again, that is right out of Downing and Andrew Jackson Davis, another prominent person associated with sort of the Gothic revival movement. This was the Richards house. They came here, they were Swedenborg. They came to Urbana because of the university. They eventually moved to Chicago. And then in later years, this was the Sewell house, Reverend Sewell, who designed the Swedenborg Church on the corner of Main and Reynolds Street. He traveled extensively through Italy as a young man, so he was inspired by that architecture, and that's why the Swedenborg Church has a Constantine or old Italian look about it. He remodeled this house during their residency here when he was president of Urbana University. So the bay windows you see where the staircase is on the inside, that was added during his time period. The porch is a little bit later, early 20th century, but great house. Inside, the inlaid floors, the faces of Greek gods carved in the mantels, just incredible. I had the honor of putting this house on the National Register when Lindsay Green lived here back in the 1990s. So this house is on the National Register of Historic Places. Bottom left, great little house. Got to meet the owner the other day out raking leaves. Like, hi, can I take a picture of your house? It's probably like, what? And it's a hard house to photograph because it, again, is one of these houses that the front of it faces south towards the other houses that grew up around it. But beautiful house, has, again, the Gothic steep detailing, the verge board, the gingerbread. The porch is a little bit more late 1880s, 1890s, but again, very cool house. Love this house. The attorney's office on Court Street, that's combination home and law office, standing across from the courthouse, but again, that Gothic detailing. Another one on Scioto Street, you can see all the Gothic pitches going on. This little vernacular Gothic house in terms of form is down on Hill Street. So historically, one of the old African-American neighborhoods of Urbana, and that was the interpretation of building Gothic revival on that street. And then the near house on Scioto Street on the far right. Missing its front porch that it would have had at one time, but still has a lot of Gothic detail going on. Italian 8, Lafayette Avenue. This little house hiding on Miami Street sets behind the parking lot and the Carrying Kitchen. There were 3 Italianate houses in a row, and they were all moved back from the street, except for the one on the corner that was demolished a few years ago. The other two were moved back from the street because when the Caring Kitchen was being built, that was being built for the new Kroger grocery store. So they pushed the other two houses back behind, and this is one of them that's intact a little bit more, but beautiful Italianate detailing. So 1840, 1885 is roughly the time period on these type of houses, commonly with a square cupola or tower, sometimes like we saw on the first slide there. Usually a low-pitched roof, wide eave overhang supported by the brackets. You can see that here on this house. Tall windows arched, either arched or squared. We got that going. One or two windows. You got the one windows down below. You got the two windows up above. Elaborate crowns over the windows and doors. Got some nice detailing going here. Either full porches or entry porches. You can see the small entry porch there on the side. And then paired or single doors with entries with single panes of glass. So those are the original front doors on this house. This would probably date from around the 1870s. And here's some Italianates around town. Scioto Street on the left, pretty much intact from its original appearance. The house on Court Street, that porch is a little bit later on the house. You can see the belvedere or the cupola up on top of that house. It's rare that those survive, but this one has it. Up on North Main Street, if anyone wants to go get a tattoo afterwards, that's where you go. There's a tattoo shop in there now. Beautiful house. The Reed House up on the far right on the corner of Sycamore and Scioto Street. The porch was changed. The house has had a stucco treatment added to it, much like the Douglas Hotel has a stucco treatment added to it. And you can still see the belvedere, the cupola up on top. And this house was moved. It originally sat more in the center of those lots, but it was moved up to the corner of Sycamore and Scioto Street around in the late 19th century, so the houses to the east of it could be eventually constructed on those lots. But originally this was sort of one of those country estate houses on the edge of Urbana. If you go outside after the program, right around the corner is the 1858 map of Urbana. The sketch of this house is on it. You can see it. Also on Scioto Street, again, later porches. They change porches all the time to be in vogue. What I call the Nelson House, 400 block of Scioto Street. It's missing its belvedere or cupola, but it's in the 1874 atlas. It did have one at one time. Little house that I call the Brand House. It was one of the early Brand houses that I have on East Reynolds Street, built in 1876. And again, the porch changed, but it's an Italianate home. And then the Smith House up on North Main with the original porch. Windows have been changed, but they're still the original height. And this guy that kind of probably gets overlooked on East Court Street, behind the Harners, again, an Italianate house. And you can tell something looks a little off about it. It's been divided into apartments. There was probably another window or doorway in the center of the second floor. If it looks like it's missing something, it probably is missing something. And the porch is a later addition, but still has a lot of its Italianate feel going on. Second Empire. Parlez-vous français? French-inspired architecture, historically. Easy to tell this one because it's got the mansard roof. If it's got a mansard roof, it's Second Empire. But it has a lot of the same detailing that you might think of with the Italianate style. So this was one of the Weaver family homes as well, built around 1872. Has the ornamental porch work added to it. Still has the railing out front, but a beautiful home, the slate up on the mansard roof, the dormers. This is on West Market near High. This one is, you can't really see all the details. This is a house hard to photograph unless you're staying out on Scioto Street, and I'm just not willing to go that far to get a good picture. And it's also being eaten by the ivy. And here's a tip. It's not a chia pet house. Ivy and buildings don't normally mix. There was a time that people thought, oh, it's beautiful, it's aesthetic, it's dreamy, let it grow in the house. Not good. Not good, especially on a masonry house, because it is holding moisture up against the brick. It is eating into the mortar. It needs to go. But I'm not going to tell that. But they got 1855 to 1885 details on this. Similar to Italianate, except for that roof line. Mansard roof with the dormers. Wide eave overhangs with the brackets, you can kind of see the brackets up there. Tall windows, check. Elaborate crown molds over the windows, check. Got the double doors on this one too, although you really can't see it from this angle. So a lot of the same characteristics of the Italian 8, except for that roof line. There are only seven homes, 7 buildings in Urbana that survive that are Second Empire. So this is a rare architectural breed in the city. This one on the left, you've been taking these pictures for a while, is the Benson House, built in 1881. He was a local contractor. He was the contractor on the old Grace Methodist Church that stood where the post office is today. So this was his personal home. So he built this house in the Second Empire style. Little house on Saddle Street next door where Pat and Patsy live today. This is actually a much older house, and it was not uncommon that they did this, that they retrofitted it to be Second Empire. So it's actually a much earlier house that they changed the roof line on it to give it more of a Second Empire style. The superintendent's house out at Oakdale Cemetery, Second Empire. House, this is historically the Donaldson House on the corner of West Reynolds and Walnut Streets, Second Empire. And historically the Chance House on Cider Street, another great example. Originally this house is in the 1874 Atlas, the Chance House. The porch was not on it at the time. The porch came a little bit later, but it's a late 19th century porch. Queen Anne. This is on Cider Street. Here's the characteristics, 1880, 1910, asymmetrical facades. And you kind of see it here on this house on South Main Street. This was a hubby house, a hubby generation later in time. And you can kind of see it's got a lot going on, right? It's got different detailing, it's got different window types, it's got gingerbread, it's got everything just going on. So asymmetrical facades, partial or full front porch, steeply pitched gabled roofs of regular shapes, usually with a dominant front-facing gable. You can see it right there. You can see the pitched roof behind it, but then that front gable. They can have towers, like this one does. Textured shingles to avoid other materials and devices used to avoid smooth wall surfaces. That's what some people call the fish scale shingles. You can see the applique detail here on the little gable above the porch. You can see the brackets on the tower, so checks all these boxes. Cutaway bays, kind of has that with the tower a little bit. Doors have delicate insides feature and upper panes of glass. Check. Ooh, beautiful door. Here's some Queen Anne's. The William Christopher House on the corner of East Reynolds and South Main, built in 1889. He came here as a cigar maker, but he mostly owned a billiard hall. Did well. The house next door to the north of it was built for his daughter, who married into the Powell family. Our home on East Reynolds Street, historically most people know it as the Hagley House. Three generations of the Hagleys lived there from 1920 to 1969. Just got the new paint schemes. People are like, I love the colors. Well, thank Cambridge, Massachusetts for the colors. House in Cambridge, Massachusetts are the colors. Brown Hall, which was originally the Moses home. That was not Brown Hall originally. It was originally the Thomas Freeman Moses home. Dr. Thomas Freeman Moses. Again, Swedenborg family. Briefly served as president for Urbana University. Old New England family. Very prominent. His father-in-law and mother-in-law lived with him. His father-in-law was a portrait artist named John Cranch. John Cranch's father was the first district judge of Washington, D.C., and John Cranch was the grandnephew of John Adams. So very, very prominent family. They built this house originally. They lived here until 1896. Then it was occupied by the Smith family. The Smith family kind of abandoned it, and it got into a debate over the Smith estate. Mrs. Smith was the first female postmistress of Urbana in the 19th century. She and her husband both died within months of each other in the 1890s. They were both in their 40s. And he was a close ally of William McKinley. So when their funerals took place here at the house, the White House sent a delegation and flowers from the White House greenhouse that were placed here in the house. Now, John Cranch was a well-known portrait artist, and his daughter Hannah, this was her house, I found her portrait on eBay, painted in 1844. And the person didn't know who John Cranch was, or who Hannah Cranch was. And it was being sold in upstate New York. So after the Moses and the Cranch family left Urbana, they're all buried here for the most part, by the way, but after they left here in 1896, they went back out east. They went back to Boston and Cambridge and the East Coast. And so that portrait hung in this house and left in 1896. Bought that portrait online, drove to upstate New York to pick it up, and met the seller at a rest park outside of New York City. He had it all wrapped, big, beautiful wooden frame. She's heavy. She's really heavy. Put her in the car, closed the door and said, okay, let me tell you about the Cranch and the Moses. And on the way back to Pennsylvania, through Pennsylvania, I told Jim, I said, you watch. I'm going to find out I'm related to Hannah Cranch and the Moseses. She was my sixth cousin. And so when we got back to Urbana, at 11 o'clock at night, Hannah's in the back seat. We drive straight to Brown Hall and do a victory lap to welcome Hannah home. She's hanging in my hallway right now. She's upstairs. But Hannah has come home. So it became Brown Hall when it was acquired by the university in 1916. Great little Queen Anne with the domed tower on it. That's on Church Street. That's on East Church Street. Yes, East Church Street. This is the Richards house on the corner of College and High Street. It has the R over the top of the porch gable yet today. And if you've been on my tours of the cemetery, this may look familiar because the Ramsey family, who originally built this house, their cemetery monument at Oakdale is the house. It's literally cut of the house in every detail of the brick from 1922. So they used the house as their cemetery monument. House down here on South Street had the tower added to it because the house to the west of it is an identical twin house, but the floor plan is reversed. And this house had the tower added to it. House on South Street, and another great little house up on West Church Street, just off of Main Street before you get to Locust. So a variety of Queen Anne types there. Folk Victorian. Lots of these examples around town. 1870, 1910, symmetrical facades, except for the gable, front and wing type. There are types of that. Spindlework porch detail, jigsaw trim. Basic house with simple folk house form. Bracketed eaves sometimes. Details can be similar to Italianate or Queen Anne. Cutaway bay windows sometimes. Front porches are similar to Italianate or Queen Anne. This little guy or lady is on East Reynolds Street, across the street from us. We bought it because it was going to be messed up if we didn't buy it, so we bought it. It right now looks like it's being tagged by graffiti gangs, so bear with us while we figure out the colors on it. But this is one of these houses where you'd be surprised on the history of this house. This house was built in 1869 by the Budge family, and the Budge who grew up in this house went on to establish the first hardware store in Miami, Florida. And he became one of its first postmasters. Very prominent family in the beginnings of Miami, Florida. So don't judge a book by its cover. Miami started here and reached out to the folks in Florida because their one house in Florida is now a house museum. And reached out and said, oh yes, here, let me put you in touch with the relatives. We know all about their Urbana connection. But they've never been there. So they sent pictures back of the family from back in the day of this, from their time in this house. And we made a special trip to Florida with a Man on the Monument Christmas tree ornament to put on their Christmas tree ornament there. And while we were in town, we're wandering around town, and they had a hardware store in this other town in Florida too. And we walk into this antique shop, I kid you not, Do you know where the Budge hardware store was by chance? They're standing at it. No. Yeah, really. Oh, we're from Urbana, Ohio. Yeah, I grew up in Urbana. You did not. Yeah, I grew up on Court Street. Yeah. So this guy happened to have an antique store and moved to Florida 30 years ago and was in the Budge hardware store, but he didn't know the connection. So it's true, 7 degrees and 6 degrees separation. So this little cottage is on West Reynolds Street. The Gatewood house on the upper right is on East Ward Street. That's a part of East Ward Street that was known as Silver Ridge. How many remember Miss Pauline Walker? Lived to be over 100. Few people? Interviewed Miss Pauline years ago. We were talking about the historic black neighborhoods of the city. Around East Market Street was known as Guinea. She didn't know why. The theory was that a lot of the early black settlers who were there back at the beginning of Urbana, way back, was thought to be from Virginia. And it was slang for Virginie. Then she talked about Gooseville, down on the south side of town, where 55 and 68 meets, kind of down there by the dental office. That area was known as Gooseville. And it became a largely predominant African-American neighborhood in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And then the other neighborhood was up here by the high school, Silver Ridge, or the Ridge. And I asked Miss Pauline, well, why did they call it Guinea? And she didn't know for sure, but she shared the story about Virginia as a theory. Well, Miss Pauline, why did they call it Gooseville? Oh, I'm not sure, honey. Well, why did they call it Silver Ridge? Oh, baby, if you lived up there, you made it, was her response. So the Gatewood house has not changed a bit. The family sent me a picture from Michigan. She's a doctor now at the University of Michigan. She sent me a family photo taken in front of this house in 1900. Looks just like it did back in the day. And this little guy down here on the corner of College and West Reynolds Street also kind of fit in that category. The Revivals. Old Johnson House on South High Street. We got Dutch Colonial, Cape Cod kind of in this classification too. Here's the breakdown. I gotta tell you about the little house. Julie knows this story because she was told this story too growing up, and this is where history gets twisted again. I remember Kay Cromwell. Kay was my neighbor when we first came to Urbana. So she'd always tell me about all of her neighbors living on West Reynolds Street, and she'd always kind of chuckle, and she goes, that house down their street, that's the whorehouse. Their names were H-O-R-R. And it was, but not that. And she always used to tell me, now this house, I've been told, was the outhouse for the house across the street. And they moved it across the street from the Marvin house to over here, and it was turned into a house. Like, wow, that's commitment. I have never heard of an outhouse turned into a house, but okay. And that story has passed down to other people for years. Wrong. This was the Lily Ring house. Her mother and father, Swedenborg family, they came here because of the university. Dr. Ring lived in the brick house on the corner of High and Reynolds Street, still there. And this house was cut off of the lot and built next door. Miss Lily was a well-known artist, but she was also a kindergarten teacher. She designed and built this house for her kindergarten studio. And it was purposely designed by her with the Colonial Revival detailings, but it was designed by her to be of scale for the kids. Well, the kindergarten didn't last too long. Then she turned it into a reading room for the Swedenborg Church. And then eventually she ended up living here. And so this was Miss Lily's house, Lily Ring's house. It was not the outhouse, as has been reported. So she had this house built about 1914, and she designed it herself.
That's the little house that sets back a little bit, right?
Yes, it sets back from the brick house on the corner. Yeah. So you can see the fan light over the door. You can see the side lights. Got the double hung windows. Got all kinds of little windows going on here. Got the column front porch. So it's a great little example of Colonial Revival. But it was actually the kindergarten house. So some other forms of colonial revivals. This is the later Moss Grove house up on the left. It was designed by an architect from Springfield in 1906. This is Miami and High Street. This dude is in the middle is a little bit in the Colonial Revival family on West Reynolds between Maine and Walnut. That's a Cape Cod. That is a Cape Cod. See the dormers? See the story hat? That's Cape Cod. So that's Cape Cod. And that is on that's on East Court Street. The Dutch colonials are easy to tell because everyone says they have the roofs like the barns. It's a gambrel roof, but yes, they have the roofs like the barn, the gambrel roof. So the Dutch colonials are easy to tell because they have those roofs. This one's unique because see the garage? The built-in subterranean garage? That's on Lafayette. The next one is on Scioto. This is an earlier version from about 1902. This is on West Church Street. And the little Dutch colonial there on the end is on Lincoln.
What year was that one up in the corner that you had?
The Cape Cod?
Yeah.
Probably about the 1930s.
When did the Dutch?
The Dutch started to come on the same time as early 1900s, 1920s, and 30s as well. Yeah. Statuesque and neoclassical, I kind of put these together when everyone goes, ooh, there's the house. So historically, this was the Loudenback house. Built about 1897. This was designed by the firm Yost and Packard. This was a Frank Packard design out of Columbus. And it's a Statuesque design. So I kind of broke this up into two things here. There's the Statuesque detailing multiple dormers, walls of masonry, steeply pitched roofs, ornamental followed the Gothic design, and they kind of do. Window units are divided, windows and doors may be arched, yep. Towers may be present, yep. Busy roof line, if you look back at that house, that's got a busy roof line, it's got a lot going on. The neoclassical, not too many examples of it in town, or the Statuesque, but this example that Bob Wetzel owned in the past is on East Church Street. It's probably an older house that had the porch here with the columns and everything added to it to make it the neoclassical design, but it's basically got that neoclassical design. So there's the time periods roughly for neoclassical: centrally balanced center door, check. Columns typically have iambic Corinthian capitals, check. Facade dominated by full height porch, classical columns, check. Doorways are typically elaborate, decorative surrounds, similar to Greek Revival Georgian style, check. Eaves are wide, even though we really can't see it much in this picture, but they are, trust me. And windows are double hung, sometimes with multiple panes, and that's the case here. So the Howard House, aka the bank, that was also converted into a neoclassical. The porch and the columns were added onto an older house later on. The Loudenback House, also known as the Astorino House. The Murphy Mansion on Saddle Street, where they moved houses out of the way to build the Murphy Mansion. Also that Statuesque design, and a little bit better picture of the house on Church Street. Great story with the Murphy Mansion. I think Jay McKeever told me this story years ago. That when the Murphy Mansion was being built around 1906, they would go in after the workmen had left for the day and walk across the floor joists, and then they were shooting, BB gun type guns into the doors of the carriage house out back, and they pulled back the door, and the buckshot had gone through the door and into Mr. Murphy's carriage. And so they literally pulled the carriage uptown to a carriage guy and had it repaired and put it back in his carriage house before the sale. Tudor Revival. We all love these houses, right, on South Main. They're side by side. They're so unusual. They were originally built by the Weaver family because the Weavers platted that area to the east of it as a subdivision. And George Weaver of the Weaver family was an attorney by trade, but he traveled through Europe. So he actually got inspired by old European architecture, and he had these two houses that are across the street from each other built, inspired by Europe. So if you look at them, it's a Tudor Revival type of house, but it's truly the old medieval looking Tudor from Europe. Tudor Revival, there's a lot of these in town. You kind of see the scriptures there of what they look like. You know them when you see them. They're pretty easy to identify. Sometimes they have the verge board. The oriel windows are the windows that stick out in the middle of the facade. Tall windows, usually in groupings, steeply pitched, that sloped roof sometimes, the rounded doors, rounded windows. Coining is a stone feature that you see sometimes on the corner of Tudor houses. It looks like stone on the corners or around the doors and the windows. Here's some Tudors. We all know the one up on the top, right? If you don't, turn in your Urbana card. But prime Tudor example on Scioto Street up in the upper right. I love the English house on the bottom right on College Way that sets way back. Actually, the English family had that house built in 1919, but it's an English Tudor. This little guy on the bottom left is on High Street off of Miami. The house here on the corner of Lafayette and Maine, and the little brick Tudor house on the corner of Lincoln and Wood Street, I think that's what it's called. Yeah, thank you. I'm testing myself. But all different variations of Tudor style. We're coming into the home stretch here. Prairie American Foursquare. This is one of the few styles actually that can be claimed truly American architecture, thanks to the people, the likes of Frank Lloyd Wright and the Prairie style movement that really got its start in Chicago through his work. So I kind of grouped Prairie and American Foursquare together. This is house on Scioto Street. The windows have been changed up on the upper floor, but still pretty much original. This is the old Second Methodist Church, the old Grace Methodist Church that was built in 1855. And in 1940, it got converted into the double that we see today. But they used kind of the prairie style architectural influences when they did it. But this is actually the old Second Methodist or Grace Methodist Church before they moved up on the post office slide. Low pitched roofs, wide overhangs, 2 stories, 1-story porches or wings, massive porch squares, you can see them there. Details or emphasizing horizontal lines. Yep, see that? Pattern or segmented panes in the upper sashes of the windows. You can see that on the windows. See how they're segmented up above, but they're blank down below. And again, it's one of the few American styles.
Where is that located, sir?
That's on East Water Street.
Okay.
Sorry, East Water between Maine and Locust, south side. Even though it's not 50 years old yet, Mike Melvin's house is prairie style. And 1987, I think, is the date on that. But beautiful example of prairie style inspired by Wright, Franklin Wright. I was on the board of the Westcott House for a time in Springfield, and then when I lived in Buffalo, I was on the board of another Frank Lloyd Wright house. And I shocked a friend who really liked Frank Lloyd Wright and was just going on and on about just Frank Lloyd Wright, Frank Lloyd Wright. And I stopped and I go, you know, he was kind of a jerk, right? He really was. So he was just something. The house on the upper right is on Lincoln, and it's kind of got the prairie form going. It's got a little bit of holdover there from Greek Revival, but it's kind of slipping into that prairie mode. The Carmazzi house on West Water Street, down here on the left. The brick house in the center on Lafayette. And the house on the right, I think, is also on Lincoln, if I remember right. But you can kind of see that 4-square thing going on. The Craftsman's and the bungalows. This one's on South Main. There's the types. I won't stand here and read them all to you, but you can kind of see sort of the characteristics. This one is on the corner of Locust and Court Street, and it was built in 1915. And there are some different examples of the craftsmen / bungalows around town. South Main Street on the left, High Street the next one over, South Main, the next one over, beautiful prime example right there. On Church Street on the far right, just off of Main Street, next door to the one up on the top, also on South Main. The one with the picket fence is actually on West Reynolds. It is actually an older house, but it got transformed into being the Craftsman style, so it's actually a much older house. Little bungalow there on West Water Street, and another little bungalow on Hill Street in the old one of the old African American neighborhoods. Home-built little house. Last one's ranch. Everyone loves ranch, right? It goes great with everything. Everyone goes, oh, we left the pretty house area, but got into ranches. There's actually some really cool ranches. I've come to appreciate them. This is one of them. This is on East Line. 1935, 75, it's like the style that just would not go away. California inspired, totally. Loosely based on Spanish colonial architecture. Roof rafters usually exposed sometimes, replacing smaller houses on large lots. So after World War II, they're on one of their big houses on big lots, and now we're going the other way. Oh, get rid of the big houses, go back to tiny houses. Make up your mind. So built on garages, they maximize the facades. They're very long facades, side gabled or cross gabled, one story typically, low pitched roofs, dominant style, modest detailing. Sometimes they have the shutters and the porch supports. They're inspired by colonial styling. So here's some ranches. These are mostly, except for the East Lawn one here on the bottom, the one on the top and the bottom three on the right are all in the Amherst and Crescent neighborhood. And if you kind of look at when that neighborhood was platted, it was all platted in the 50s and 60s. So all these houses are very at the height of ranch style houses. The one up on the top is actually on East Water Street as you get closer to Patrick Avenue. That one was built in 1958. Murphy Lumber actually had an advertising promoting this house because they used Murphy Lumber when they built it. Don't you love the ad? How atomic, you know? With pattern books, mailer homes, and kid homes. Like, time for dinner, there's June Cleaver in the door. So, advocate for the pattern, mailer, and kid homes. I put these all together. This is the final stretch here. The pattern books, people could look at a pattern book and build that house. The mail order homes, Sears, Montgomery Ward's, others. Most people know Sears, but they went under different names like Honor Built, Standard Built, but they were actually Sears. They had brand names. Kid homes, you picked the plan, they shipped you the pieces, you put it together. But sometimes people just bought the plan. And then they had the local contractor put the house together, or they did themselves. As this went on in the late 19th century, early 20th century, these were really affordable houses for people. You could get a really nice house for like $1,400 or less. And all the pieces, you just had to put it together. But it was, again, response sometimes to past housing crunches. That was the Lustron house in 1948 when the Lustron company began in Columbus. It was in response to, after the war, people needing fast, affordable housing.
So everything was included in that when you ordered it?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Some assembly required, you know. Some homeowners just bought the plans, and some would make alterations to the original plans. So they don't always match up, but they come close. We have a lot on these, and I don't need another project, but putting this presentation together, like, oh, I'm gonna have to do a tour about the kid houses of Urbana. I can see it now, because there are a lot. So here's just a few examples. The Queen Anne type house on the upper right is on East Reynolds. There's the plan from the Radford book. And I have this in my collection. There it is. This is from 1904, the Radford house plan book. And that house is in there. And the Jones house, this was built by a prominent African-American family. This was built by their son, Charles Jr. This was his, and I'm quoting from the newspaper, his summer home, because he was the mayor of Lovejoy, Illinois, which is out by St. Louis, and he was the principal of the schools. The Jones family, old African-American family in Urbana, he built this house on the site of his mother and father's house. He had the old house moved away, I'm not sure where it went, and then he built this house on the site. And this house continued to be lived in by he and his siblings until the last one died in 1937. And the house went up in 1907. Yeah, look familiar? The little house down here on the bottom left is on West Market Street, just kind of past the post office drive-in on the south side. This was the Todd sisters' cottage. They built this as their home, two spinster sisters, and it is the Rodessa. You can see the twins there. Slightly different with the arched opening on the porch gable, but it's the Rodessa. That was built in 1922. And you can see that this house could be built for payments as low as $25 to $35 a month. Wouldn't we like that today? Down on South Main, the model up on the left is the Americas. And you can see it's a little bit different from the porch. And then you can see the Cape Cod. That is probably a kid house on Court Street. And of course, this one is well known across from the high school on Wood Street, that is a Sears kit house as well. And if you look across trout lines right now on West Ward Street, there's a little white house there that they're working on behind the old VFW. That's a Sears house too. That's a Sears house. There's the Lustron. There's only 2 of these in Champaign County. The other is down by the county line. It's not, has not fared as well as this one. But I got so excited, and this is one of these moments where someone's security camera picked me up. Can I help you? Just take a picture of house, Lustron fan. Don't shoot me. but I've never seen one. I got really excited. She probably thought I was out of my mind. I was like, oh my gosh, you got the advertising on the screen door. I've never seen that on a Lustron house before. So it literally has the Lustron feature on the original screen door. But these are the cool houses, even the garage. So this is one of the best preserved Lustron houses I have ever seen in all my travels. But there's only 2 in Champaign County, and this one is by far the one that's most intact. Woo! We made it through the talk. Y'all feel better now about your architecture. You're gonna go out there and say, that's a Queen Anne. That's a Greek revival. The test will be later. Any questions for me? I'll try to answer them. If not, my dad always said, how do you know all this stuff? You just make it up and they'll never know. They'll know. I never make it.